All right, we're holding steady. So I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Moss Madness webinar. My name is Adriana Lovell, and I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. I'll be your webinar host today. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A panel as we go. We have about a 30-minute presentation with time for questions and answers at the end, and we'll have some optional polls throughout the webinar that you can get ready to participate in. We'll have a survey at the end of the webinar. We'd love for you to fill it out. We're joined online by about 25 people right now. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to have you here for our first ever moss-related webinar. And just because I'm sure plenty will be interested, we'll have a recording of this available afterwards on the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District YouTube channel, and all attendees and registrants will get a copy of that one as well. So that's it for housekeeping. I'll share some brief introductions and then we'll get to the mossy stuff. So Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District is a local government agency. Our mission is to create a sustainable, productive, and healthy environment for the Washington County, Oregon community. We serve residents of the county by providing educational opportunities, advice about caring for natural resources, and financial assistance for conservation projects. So streamside planting, urban gardening, pollinator education, manure management, forestry support, webinars like these, you name it. We help with all those things, and it's all at no cost to people in the county. This webinar is actually coming from a conservation education grant that was provided by Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in the presentation. We have a wide range of projects that we run through community members and fund through community members. You can find out a lot of that on Tualatin SWCD.org, and I'll drop that in the chat as well under our grants and funding webpage. There's a lot more details. So we're here today to talk about mosses. And as we discuss this important topic, it's essential for our district to also acknowledge the original and ongoing stewards, the indigenous people of the land, where we now provide conservation services. At Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, we honor this land and its original inhabitants from time immemorial, the Tualatin Band of Kalapuya. They have lived and prospered by maintaining strong cultural ties to the land through the wise use of and management of resources. The Tualatin Band of Kalapuya were signers of the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, which ceded their homelands to the United States in exchange for certain rights and benefits. They were subsequently removed from their homelands to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation, where they became members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Their descendants live on as tribal members today, carrying on the traditions and cultures of their ancestors, the original people of this land. And with that, I would like to welcome our presenters and share a little bit about who you're going to be hearing from today. So first up is Danlyn Brennan, who has worked in all aspects of the plant world for over 2 decades as a farmer, forager, certified herbalist, and distiller of botanical spirits. Also, as a plant biophysicist and biologist, they have published academic articles on how moss biology impacts atmospheric chemistry and recommendations for integrating plants and moss into urban environments. They are continuing their education as a graduate civil and environmental engineering student at Portland State University. They also enjoy teaching regenerative farming and sustainable foraging techniques and are dedicated to daily climate actions. Thank you, Danlyn. And Kieran Sikdar has over 20 years of experience using decentralized green infrastructure and regenerative solutions to solve stormwater management and natural resource challenges. A certified floodplain manager, water harvesting professional, permaculture designer, and soil food web trainee, Kieran is experienced in water quality, water security, water conservation, and soil health program development, policy, best practices, stakeholder engagement, and training. He has worked from the home scale to the basin scale in the watershed planning and engineering design, and focusing on regenerative solutions with green infrastructure and low impact development. Kieran serves on the Pima County Regional Flood Control District Advisory Committee, the Hillsborough Environmental Stewardship Committee, and most notably as an Associate Director of the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. So all of that being said, welcome everyone. Again, feel free to use the chat in the Q&A function. We'll monitor those questions throughout and pop them in throughout the presentation, or bring them towards the end for some final Q&A time. So with that, I'll give it to our presenters.
Thank you, Adriana. I appreciate the welcome and hosting us, and especially the SWCD's, the district's support for this project. It's been a great opportunity. And as I was reflecting on this, back when I was writing the grant for this pre-COVID in a different world, we actually have gotten a grant extension. So it's been quite a long time since Danlyn and I originally met and got this these ideas together and put this project on paper, and it's great that we're at this moment sharing this with everybody here. So I'm very excited to be here today. I am here more as a cheerleader and enthusiastic implementer of moss related things. I started out, actually lived in Arizona for a number of years, collecting mosses where I could find them in the deserts, and working on green infrastructure projects in fairly arid environments, just experimenting to see if mosses would establish in some of my projects, taking them in very small quantities and trying to reestablish them. And that's how I got interested in mosses, when they actually could and would survive and thrive in my own landscape and in some of the public projects I did throughout Tucson and believe it or not, even Phoenix, Arizona. And I feel like if mosses can thrive and live in Phoenix, Arizona, they'll thrive anywhere. And then moving to Hillsborough and Washington County, I mean, it's been like heaven for me, seeing what's available here and the land of mosses. So this project is really intended to, we actually are also working on a tree grant. So this, as Adriana mentioned, this is part of a conservation education grant. And we also have a tree grant looking at doing some research and to incorporate mosses more into green infrastructure projects, restoration work, understanding their impacts on water quality, which we'll talk more about later. But this is really just an opportunity to engage everybody in what can we learn about mosses? How can we better celebrate them in the landscape? What are opportunities to enjoy them and maybe get out of their way a little bit more, let nature do her thing? And what are some opportunities to look at reducing chemical use in the landscape and a number of other things? So we're very excited to share this information with you. And this project is also in collaboration with Swallowtail Waldorf School. So we've worked with them to offer classes to their students, and part of this grant now that we're fulfilling is sharing some of the information we've developed through a public webinar. So I want to thank Swallowtail, the Tualatin SWCD, and also the company that I work for, West Consultants, that has been a big supporter of this work. And we're really excited to look at how we can, as an engineer, how can I look at mosses as a new tool in the toolkit to provide engineering services and solutions to some of our natural resource challenges. So as the celebrator and much less knowledgeable person about mosses, I will turn it over to the wonderfully passionate and knowledgeable Danlyn to take over for the rest of the presentation. I'll jump back in and as needed throughout.
Yeah, feel free to interject anytime. Thank you so much for everyone for showing up and coming here and have an interest in moss. It's not too often that I get to speak to such a large audience about something I'm so passionate about and that's so overlooked, I think, in the landscape. So yeah, thank you so much for the sponsorship from Swallowtail, allowing me to teach the classes. That's been great. Kids get really excited about moss, and I think you can also get really excited about moss along with me. So yeah, let's just dive right in. Let's see if I can get it to move forward. There we go. So first thing first, I wanted to get an idea and kind of ask you all, like, when you think about moss, like what do you think of? What kind of feelings does it evoke in you? And there'll be a poll up. So I'm going to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, or sorry, 1 to 5, I believe we have. Do you see mosses as pesky, or maybe you see it more as pretty and you like to keep it around? Of course, this audience might be biased, but it'd be really cool to get to know the lay of like how everyone feels about moss from the get-go. Hopefully you can see that poll.
Yeah, I see that participation rate trickling up. We're about 85, 88. One more second. All right, let's see what we got. And share.
Well, yay. Oh, well, I figured. a lot of you really do appreciate moss for its aesthetic qualities, right? And definitely it can be a little pesky, right? Especially here in the Pacific Northwest, where you see a lot of people. I mean, there are whole companies that just they make a living off of removing moss for people. So keeping all of that in mind, we're going to go just right to the basics. Like, what exactly is moss? So mosses, you might know, are also called bryophytes. There are a few different bryophytes that exist, but it's the bryophyte phylum is mostly consists of mosses. And so they call biologists or moss biologists like me, bryologists. So all this fun vocabulary. They even have like these whole articles or journals that are just for bryology and bryologists. So it's a whole world out there. But mosses are little flowerless plants. And you know, you've seen them. They grow in tufts and colonies, kind of like bacteria almost, but fluffy. And they grow in two different patterns. Maybe you know this. So there's acrocarps, I'm sure you've seen, different ones that grow up as like one branching shoot. And then there's pleurocarps, which have many branches, the ones that kind of look like feathers or branch off over trees and on the cement. So since they're flowerless plants, they use, and instead of using like flowers and seeds, mosses reproduce by creating spores. So, and they're held in a little capsule. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, probably, I don't know, over the illustration here, but the capsule, right? You might have seen it, this little thing that buds out the top of the mosses. And that's because the life cycle of a moss is divided into these two different stages. There's the gametophyte stage, so where it's just the green, you know, leaves and the branches. And then there's the sporophyte stage. So when it kind of shoots up that little capsule and you see that. So that's almost, I kind of think of it as like a moss flower, but it's not a flower. And that's because sexual reproduction in moss is a bit different from a sunflower, right? Most of the moss species are dioicous. Maybe you've heard of the word dioecious, like in trees, where there's a male and female. There's a special term for moss, of course. There's a lot of special terms for moss, and it's dioicous. So that's a fun one. Of course, like bryologists have their whole own moss, vocabulary, and there's even, I have a whole moss glossary of terms, so I can use them appropriately when identifying mosses and looking at them under the microscope. But mosses they have a interesting reproductive cycle where they alternate between haploid, which would be one chromosome, and then diploid generation. So diploid, like we are, because we have two parents, so two chromosome sets from the parents. The haploid generation is called that gametophyte, and then the diploid generation is when it gets fertilized and has a sporophyte. So I've had to sex lots of moss plants and look at them under the microscope and identify whether they're male or female. So the antheridia then is the egg cell. So that would be the female moss forms antheridia, and then the males form archegonia. So so did I say that wrong? No, I mixed it up. So the antheridium produces the sperm cells and the archegonia produces the egg cells. And the moss sperm, they actually end up swimming to the archegonia to fertilize the egg to then create a zygote, right? And that's kind of a fun topic that we could get into too, is like, how do the moss sperm move around? There's a lot of cool research that shows that tiny little invertebrates and little vertebrate species move the moss sperm around. So there's whole articles on that that are kind of fun to get into. But it's cool because then that sporophyte that comes up puts that capsule all the way up and opens its peristome. It's like the operculum. Operculum is kind of this cap that looks like these little teeth go over it, and then it opens up when it dries out, and the spores then get to move through the water and in the air and disperse and germinate into new baby gametophytes. So the reproduction method has been very successful, clearly, because they are some of the oldest living plants on Earth. and they have fossils date back to 470 million years ago. So that's really far back. That's before any vascular plants took hold of the land. So moss are very, very ancient, and they are tough. Evolutionarily speaking, they've lived through 5 of 6 mass extinction events. So the 5 major extinction events that have happened behind us are the I'm going to say that wrong, Ordovician Silurian extinction. So this is around when the first vascular plants came on the land, there was a huge wipeout of species. And then again, for the late Devonian extinction, that's about 375 million years ago, there was another wipeout of a lot of species. And then again, the Permian Triassic extinction, and then the very popular Jurassic extinction, that's about 200 million years ago. And the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, the last one, which actually took out the dinosaurs, that was around 66 million years ago. And the one that's really notable, though, is the Permian Triassic extinction, and that occurred about 252 million years ago. That wiped out over 90% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. So that moss, they still made it past all of those extinction events. So despite those, though, the mosses, they survived, they evolved into diverse groups in which we see today. But of course, mosses, it's hard to know what the fossil record really holds to show how old they are, just because a lot of fossils for mosses don't keep, or the mosses don't keep enough to create the fossil. So, but we do know that mosses are known for their ability to survive in extreme environments, like Kieran said, finding them in Arizona. That's not unheard of. Actually, you'll find them in a lot of deserts. And in polar regions, we actually have a lot of researchers at Portland State University that go to Antarctica every year just to study mosses. So, and also in the high altitude mountains, you'll find them down, near the ocean and also up high on mountains. So it's because mostly they have adapted to then enter dormant states when those conditions are unfavorable, like really, really hot summers. And then they're able to resume their growth when the conditions become more favorable and more wet. Right, so this adaptability is what has helped them survive all those extinction events. Many scientists believe that we're currently experiencing the 6th mass extinction event in Earth's history. You may have heard of it, called like the Anthropocene extinction or the Holocene extinction. And this extinction event, unfortunately, is driven by our human activities, such as habitat destruction, pollution, climate change, of course, overfishing and hunting. So many species, including mosses, are at risk of extinction due to those human activities. But there are conservation efforts, of course, thanks to many groups, such as doing projects like what we're doing is habitat protection. We're reintroducing species and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of course, which is all critical to preventing further extinction events and hopefully preserving that biodiversity that we already have. So you can spend your money removing moss all you'd like, but you're up against a strong contender because it has a pretty impressive track record for sticking around. So humans are, showing up late to the show, a geological time. They're kind of new friends to moss, right? So throughout our short history, people have used mosses for many, many purposes. Maybe you didn't hear of or knew how moss has been so useful to us in the past. But it's very well known for being insulation in homes. So I don't know if you can see this. I tried to find a good picture to demonstrate it, but I've seen it, and maybe you have too, in really old buildings, and mostly on the East Coast, I'll see this too, is moss is incorporated into the cracks, is like filling material for walls and roofs. And it's also been used as wound dressing because it's very absorbent and it can help control bleeding and also other human leaks. If you have kids, you're familiar with, actually, moss has been used historically as like diapers. Basically, they make these little satchels. The Gwich'in and the First Nations people of Canada and Alaskan Natives, they have well documented their traditional use of dry sphagnum moss, and it's been stuffed and sewn into cloth sugar bags and used as diapers. And there's still ongoing Indigenous-led initiatives to keep those traditions alive, kind of like this mossbagproject.org, which is pretty cool to check out. So naturally, you'd expect it to be used as bedding too, right? For animals, and particularly in regions where other types of bedding like grasses weren't available. And it's been used as fuel. So moss can be dried up and used as a fuel source, but it does have a low heat value, so it doesn't burn at a really high heat. So it's not a particularly efficient fuel, and that's why it's important to research and understand like local laws regarding peat moss harvesting, because it was over harvested historically. And it's worth considering that there are more sustainable alternatives to using peat moss if you use it in gardening, such as core or compost. In the European Union, actually, peat moss harvesting is heavily regulated, and many countries have implemented bans or restrictions even on its use because peat moss is a non-renewable resource. Because it forms so slowly over thousands and thousands of years, once it's gone, it's kind of gone for our lifetime. So its harvesting can have significant impacts on the environment, including destruction of the ecosystem, obviously, and it releases a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when it's harvested. So as a result, many countries have implemented regulations to limit or prohibit peat moss harvesting. And maybe a less appetizing use is that it has been used as moss, as a food source, moss food, but don't be fooled don't be fooled with the food that people have named moss stuff, because a lot of times it's lichen that's used instead of moss. I think in Iceland, there's a soup that they call moss soup, but it's actually Centaurea icelandica, which is a lichen and more of a fungus. But real moss has been used during famines, like in Norway during the Napoleonic Wars. It was a source of Scandinavian bark bread, where they used to take the outer bark of trees that still had moss on it and grind it and bake it into breads, giving it a distinct flavor. I really want to try it out. Maybe some of you have. I'm not sure. I don't know who's baking barks into their breads often, but it sounds like it's worth trying. But maybe you have been familiar with a lot of moss being used as decorative element, right? There are whole gardens and other art forms, especially in Japan, where moss is used to create lush and like natural appearances in the garden, and also in cultivating bonsai. So there's an art form called kokedama, which literally translates to moss ball. So you can create little landscapes and have moss be like the grass on the ground. So it's really pretty. They're fun to make. And moss is used as medicine historically, and most recently, there's been a lot of research on deriving compounds from bryophytes, moss, liverworts, and lichen for pharmaceutical use. So that's kind of stuff that hasn't hit the market necessarily, but there's a lot of interesting research in that area. But overall, historical uses of mosses demonstrate that it's been very versatile and useful in various aspects of human life. And you might wonder too, why is there so much moss in the Pacific Northwest? And it is obviously because moss like wet. So naturally you would find them there in the Pacific Northwest region. So it's all like the Pacific Northwest of North America, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, obviously Northern California, you see a lot of it too. And that's because this region is known for its diverse and abundant moss flora, not just because it's wet. It's actually a very special location in the world. And actually, according to the Flora of North America project, there are approximately 750 species of mosses in the Pacific Northwest region. And that's almost 70% of all moss species in the entire world. And that statistic blew me away when I heard it. I know there was a lot of moss around here, but I didn't realize like this is the moss, location in the world. If you want to study moss, you come here. So mosses, of course, have several adaptations that allow them to retain so much water, and that's essential for their survival. So that's why you'll find them in these damp and shaded habitats most of the time, or on the north side of the roof, right? And mosses retain water so well because they have a hygroscopic nature, right? And that means they absorb and retain moisture from the air. The surface of the stems of moss, if you look under a microscope, is covered with tiny little hairs, even in between the leaves. And those are called rhizoids. There's more at the bottom of it. So rhizoids are kind of like little roots, but they don't function like roots, how we would think of in trees. So they don't have roots that distribute water to the upper portions. So they rely on wicking power of the cells themselves. So the cells of mosses, they have very thin cell walls, and the leaves are only 1 cell thick, which is cool. Then that's why they look really awesome under the microscope. So I wanted to share a few pictures. And that's what allows them to move water in and out very easily. So it allows them to absorb very quickly and then also dry very quickly. So they have a very high desiccation tolerance, is what it's called. And that means that some species of mosses can tolerate long periods of drought by entering that state of suspended animation. So during that time, the moss dries out, becomes dormant, and then it can quickly revive itself and resume growth once again, after it becomes wet. And that's why over the summer, it seems like, oh, I don't see any moss anywhere. And then suddenly when it gets wet, it's like all the moss pops back. Actually, it's been sitting there the whole time. It just kind of becomes less vibrant. Overall, though, mosses have evolved a range of adaptations, and that allows them to survive in environments with very limited water availability, like in Arizona, right? So that's what makes moss a really good sponge, these adaptations. And actually, mosses can hold up to 20 times their dry weight in water, which means then if you have a patch of moss that weighs 1 pound, it can hold up to 20 pounds of water, which is very impressive as like a soaking property. So of course, the actual amount of water that mosses can retain kind of depends on the species, which is something that we're trying to figure out in the moss labs that I've worked in, is which species work best for absorbing different things, water and other stuff too, because water isn't the only thing that mosses can absorb. So to ask a question to all of you. How do you think mosses improve our environment? Now that you have a little idea of like how mosses interact with their environment, what do you think they can do for, I guess, humans and other living animals? What do you think they can do to improve our environment? Just any ideas? Just curious to see where your mind goes. Give you a few moments to fill in. All right. I think then the poll has to be stopped before I can move forward too. So
We've got responses
Yeah.
slowly coming in. People are putting
cool.
some good thoughts to it. Yeah. I'll go a
Nice,
little
thank
more.
you. Yeah, I'm moving quick. Sorry, I get all excited and I speak very quickly. So hopefully I can slow down a little bit.
All right. I'm going to
Cool.
go ahead and close it and share those results. I'm giving people 5 seconds.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's great. I'm really curious.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, okay. So 100% answered, which is awesome.
Can
That's
you see
great.
some of the responses? Let me see.
I can't see the responses.
Let me see. I'll share a few. We have 30 responses: absorb chemicals, hold water, water conservation, clean the air, survive drastic climate change impacts in our carbon sinks, prevent runoff, sequester carbon, support insects, help break down vegetation, water quality filtering, habitat, prevent floods and reduce drought, keep water from running off, helping to keep other plants moist in drought conditions, ? Soil stores moisture to release for other plants, insulates other plants against drought and freezing, slow down runoff, regulate local temps and humidity, reservoir of water storage, water retention, biodiversity, enhance air quality, clean air and water, absorb runoff from storms, hold moisture, providing material for animals to build their homes, insulate and provide nursery environment for seedlings, capture carbon, nitrogen cycling, moisture control, help with carbon sequestration, help provide habitat food, absorbing pollution,
Yes.
more natural source of diapers. All right, just a couple more. Improving
It's
air
awesome.
quality, CO2, water purification, water transport, irrigation, limiting runoff and erosion, moisture retention, oxygen, remove pollutants, purify the air, retain water, stability, erosion control, habitat, and protecting soils. Thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thorough. It's like you were all, I don't need to convince you. I don't need to convince anyone here that mosses are important because you all know exactly how much, you know, they impact our environment. And it's just something that I think is overlooked. And that's why I'm so passionate about moss, because it does so much and it plays such an important role in our lives. And I just, yeah, like Kieran said, I want to celebrate it. So let's talk about some really cool ways that we have been improving our environment with moss. Let me see, can I move forward here? Awesome. So something you may not have heard of, because it kind of happens more in like, you know, in weird spaces in academia, but mosses are used as biomonitors in environmental studies to assess quality of the air, water, and soil. So, and that's because since they're non-vascular plants, right, mosses obtain the water and nutrients directly from the environment through their leaves, right? Their biology makes them really, really good as biomonitors. And then that allows us to, like, because they're so highly responsive to the changes in their surroundings, it gives us a good idea of what's happening in the environment at that moment. So it's kind of like a natural, you know, meter of pollutants in the area. So, and like some of you said, they absorb pollutants. Mosses absorb pollutants from the air, water, and soil. And those pollutants are like heavy metals, nitrogen, sulfur, other organic compounds that may not be so healthy for us. And the concentration of these pollutants in the moss then can be used to estimate the level of pollution in the surrounding environment. Maybe some of you remember a local story back in 2016 about a study by the United States Forest Service. That's a few of my friends were a part of. They analyzed moss samples that were collected around Portland for concentrations of heavy metals. And the US Forest Service found cadmium at its highest concentrations near the Bullseye glass manufacturing facility in Southeast Portland. And cadmium is a top concern for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So that was a problem for Bullseye glass and the neighbors in the area. But you'll be happy to know that they've since cleaned up their production facility and no longer emit high levels of cadmium into the neighborhood. I actually tried to convince them to let me install a moss like eco roof in a building close to them, but they weren't that interested in having that installed. And I wasn't going to test it for heavy metals. We were just going to try to do some cool moss eco roof stuff, which I've been involved in. But yeah, it's really cool how it's been used as a kind of a detective in these pollution mysteries. But they have great biomass accumulation, which is awesome. They can accumulate biomass very quickly, which then means we can grow it very quickly. And they can also accumulate pollutants from the environment quick because they're growing so much. They're also increasing their like sink capacity. And that's what makes them useful for monitoring short-term changes in pollution. So like those heavy metals and also the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, you may have heard, or PAHs, all the emissions and stuff. So I've always thought like, wow, we should line, you know, all the highways stuff with just walls covered in moss so that it accumulates all of that onto it and it's not in the air, right, in those concentrated kind of emissions areas. And since mosses are widely distributed and they're found across many different types of habitats from like urban areas and rural areas, it makes them useful for this monitoring. So because they're going to be there. So you can collect what has already been there that's naturally growing in the trees, or you can use standardized moss material like you'll see here in this. This looks like I don't know, I'm making some moss soup, but that is they're growing moss in a nutrient solution so that you can have a standardized moss material. And this is actually a sphagnum species. This is done by Professor Ralph Reske in Germany. He's really well known for being like the sphagnum guy. He's even he patented a sphagnum type that is really, really good at pulling up pollutants, right? So there's lots of different tests you can do. I know I'm working with a group right now who's testing a bunch of different species against this standardized moss to see if it does a better job than the sphagnum that's grown by Ralph Resky. And then they take that moss and they put it into these moss spheres. So those moss spheres are then kind of set up like you would a filter, right? It's packed with material, and then they hang them in trees in an area that you wanted to be monitoring. So maybe next to a road, or like something like bullseye glass, putting it there to keep an eye on those emission levels that are coming from whatever the source may be. So that makes this very, very easy for sampling on, on the laboratory end, where then you're testing all this. It's so easy to work with as a material. It's very cost effective. It's convenient. They're light. They're easy to care for, and they're really fun to grow, and they're pretty and green. So there's a lot of pluses to working with moss as a biomonitor. And then when you analyze those concentrations of the pollutants, those scientists can then give valuable information back to the public about the level and type of pollution in an area. So this information can be used to guide environmental policies and management decisions aimed at reducing pollution in areas and protecting human and ecosystem health. So some really cool stuff, I think, is happening where we're actually adding moss to the environment to add added health benefits to our infrastructure. So while mosses have been used for centuries, right, for traditional medicine and other various purposes like the wound healing, right, even medicine like inflammation reduction, pain relief and stuff, there's limited research right now on the health benefits of applying more moss to our environments. I've been involved in some of those with the moss eco roofs and how they affect the air quality in the area, but there have been a lot of papers that have come out showing, statistics that there are several potential benefits, and those have been suggested by researchers, including myself, that we think that it should be brought to commercialization, right, to add to our environments. And there are some companies that are doing it, like Respire here in the Netherlands and Green City Solutions in Germany. They created an air purifier. They have them in airports and I guess out in the public too. So that's really cool. But we all know that the aesthetics are psychologically pleasing, right? There's a lot of benefits that, and they have been recorded in some studies too, that mosses can enhance the aesthetics of an environment, and they provide a calming and relaxing effect that can improve moods and reduce stress levels. I know there have been studies around plants and just green in general. The color of green in hospitals actually helps people heal faster. So we also know that moss added on walls and spaces, along with other plants, can reduce noise, because mosses then help absorb and block sound waves, which can then reduce the noise pollution in an area, which has negative health effects such as hearing loss, stress, and even disturbing sleep, especially in urban areas. And we definitely know that moss improves air quality. So because mosses can absorb pollutants from the air, like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, which actually that is like one of the main causes of respiratory problems, is mostly the particulate matter. And they're really, really good at absorbing the PM. I think 2.5 is like the big one that can result in really bad respiratory illnesses in humans and animals too. So you might know as well, because you already mentioned, that mosses have a high capacity for water absorption, and they remove pollutants from the water through those processes. They do it through adsorption, but they also do it through ion exchange. So there's kind of a passive way of removing pollutants and an active way of removing pollutants. The active way is a little less known, but is being currently researched. And that's because they're exchanging ions with the environment. And so some really cool stuff. I wish I could show you like the preliminary results from some of the research I've been helping out with, but we're seeing that mosses are actually responding to their environment, and they will pull up certain things. And then after a while, they even release it back because they're like, oh, I don't like that anymore. So there's a really active interaction happening, especially in water. So mosses, we know, are used as biofilters for air, and they're starting to be used for biofilters in water. So that's because, of course, they're absorbing those excess nutrients, and taking the nutrients out of water like nitrogen and phosphorus is really important, because we know that those can cause harmful algal blooms and they degrade water quality overall. So, and they also, of course, absorb the heavy metals. So like copper, lead, and zinc, which are toxic to aquatic organisms and humans. And they also absorb organic compounds from the water, like pesticides and pharmaceuticals. So a lot of the other compounds that are in the water that we're just now being able to detect, like PFAS, one of them. There's some research happening to see like how well do mosses remove them versus other filtration methods. But you might guess that they also regulate pH of water. So they absorb and release hydrogen ions. So that then changes the pH of the water. And you've probably seen this in aquarium mosses, right? Maybe some of you have aquariums where you add moss to help the health, to create a healthy environment for the fish. So mosses are used as living mats, so they're used live, and they're also used as dead material. And that material can be mixed with others like sand, gravel, and activated carbon to then enhance a filtration capacity of something, or you can use them as they're living and they're doing their filtration actively, like what I was mentioning. And there's a lot of research occurring right now to determine the best species and protocols for water filtration. It's really exciting because that would be really great to commercialize a water filtration system, because of course, like I said, like they're inexpensive, they're easy to cultivate, and they could be used in a variety of water treatment systems, from small scale like household filters to large scale industrial applications. And yeah, I want to share with you all the cool research I know that's happening. And I know they're doing a study in South America where they're testing these moss filters on kind of a large scale because of how polluted some of the waters are going to poor villages. So I'm really excited to see the research and the results from that, because we think it's going to not only, add to the science, and we can understand like, yes, mosses are helping, but it's now helping people. And that's great. Get moss on board. So now that you're all moss experts, I thought we could play a little game. Is it moss? I love playing this game with people. I play it with my friends as we're walking around. Can you identify any mosses in these pictures? I'm going to have images for you. I have some images A, B, C. If it is a moss, go ahead and choose that moss, or choose that image, I should say. If there are no mosses in any image, you could choose D. And then E is an option if still not sure. Yeah, you can go ahead and choose whichever one. I'll give you some time. I think 10 seconds to choose. I have a few slides, like 3 of them to go through. It's a little tricky, right? A lot of people come to me, they're like, hey, Danlyn, I found this really cool moss. Which one is this? I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not moss. Like, what? Like, I know you have to go back, try to find another one. But there's a lot of moss around here, so you're bound to find one moss species.
Right, I'm going to go ahead and pause the poll.
Okay.
3 more seconds if you want to vote. 3, 2, 1. And there we go. And there's the results.
Ooh, all right. Yeah, gotcha. So I know, and if you wanted to get technical, I do see moss in image B. It's kind of behind the lichen. So for those of you who chose B, you're technically correct, because there is some in the picture. But picture A and picture C are not moss. There's no moss in those. A is the one that kind of looks like a moss in the lower left-hand corner. That's a hornwort. Sorry, that's a hornwort. And I wish I could get up closer and show you, but you'll see it looks different than than a moss. And then C is a liverwort, which tricks me all the time too. I might go running up to something, I'm like, that's a liverwort. Liverworts are really cool too. I could do a whole other presentation on those. But to the next one. Oh. 10 seconds. Can you identify any moss in these pictures? And these are all my pictures. I have a huge library of moss, liverwort, plant pictures to choose from, which made this really hard because I have a lot of really cool pictures of moss. All right. A moss, B moss.
All right, I'll give it 5 more seconds, then close it. All right.
A, yes. All right. Ooh, look at that. A and C. So C, again, tricking you with the liverworts. It's a really pretty, very, very pretty liverwort. Again, a bryophyte. No one got tricked by the sedum picture. That's good. Really sharp. Oh, and yes, none of these. Nice. I mean, A might be a little hard. That's a Centrichia species, really pretty. That one under the microscope too just looks like stained glass. I would love to do a whole thing just on looking at moss under the microscope. It's a lot of fun. And then this last one here, can you identify any moss in these pictures? Give you 10 seconds for this. It's the easy one.
All right, and I'm closing the poll.
Right, yeah, you got it. So that, right, this one would be a pleurocarp. It has many branches. I think this is one of the more beautiful mosses that I see in the urban area. I live downtown, in downtown Portland, so I get to see all the urban mosses and admire them. And this is Hylicomnium. Oh wait, sorry, it is Hylicomnium. And that one is all over. I bet you can go out and see it. It especially likes to grow on cement walls. So an A is a foliose lichen. So that one, you might have seen it. That's in its reproductive stage. And so that's a whole other topic that we could get into, how to lichen reproduce. What the heck? A B is another lichen, more an Usnea species. But yep, you got it. C is the moss here. So now that you're all inspired to make your very own moss crafts and moss band-aids, I wanted to touch on sustainable harvesting guidelines. Harvesting moss sustainably is important to maintain the health of moss populations, even though they're so abundant here. The ecosystems that they rely on, you could upset the balance if you were to remove all the moss in an area. So just keeping that in mind, I wanted to leave you with like 5 considerations, right? Is know the species of moss that you might want to collect. So like I said, right, there's a lot of moss species and they all have different growth rates and ecological requirements. So understanding the biology and ecology of the species of interest then can help you determine if it's suitable, or if it's suitable for harvesting and how much can be taken without harming the population. So that's no easy task, of course, because there's over 12,000 species. So usually how I've been doing it is getting to know them one by one. And that's how we learn each other's names, right? So I'll give you one to look up. I don't have it on the screen and I can type it in the chat then, but it's Ceratodon purpureus. It's an acrocarp moss and you'll find it all over. It's one of the most common mosses ever. I'd say probably most of the moss that you might see, especially growing on the sidewalk, is Ceratodon. So Ceratodon, to me, it sounds like a dinosaur, but Ceratodon moss. So there's your first moss to get to know. And when you're harvesting moss, of course, consider an appropriate location. Not only are mosses really pretty to look at in an area, they play important roles in the ecology, right? So soil erosion control, which someone mentioned, is great. Soil erosion control is a big one. Water regulation too, even how water stays in an area or leaves the area, right? Because they hold water in place, and that's really important. So avoid harvesting moss from sensitive habitats such as wetlands, riparian areas, and in old growth forests, which is where you see a lot of this beautiful moss. And it's easy to get big eyes for moss. I'm like, oh my God, there's so much of it. But if you harvest from areas that are already disturbed, such as roadsides and construction sites, kind of where moss is considered a nuisance, that's better. Although I do recommend like washing moss if you're going to use it or do crafts with it, if you're taking it from a highly polluted area, because again, remember, it absorbs a lot of those pollutants. So just keep in mind that you want to choose an appropriate location. And also harvest in moderation. Since mosses have a pretty slow growth rate, it can take years or decades to recover from heavy harvesting. So take only a small amount of moss from each location and like allow time for it to come back before going back to that same spot. I usually take pieces like in little chunks off the area, and usually in areas that honestly like people can't see. If I go to like an old deserted parking lot and it's really pretty in the front where people are walking by, I don't take from those areas. Maybe I'll take from like the corners or around spots where it doesn't look like someone was harvesting chunks of moss out of it. I don't know. That's just my own thought process. But I recommend also using appropriate tools. So as you can see here, like I have a scraper that I use for getting certain mosses, right? So I can just take the whole tuft. So the bottom, which has the rhizoids, and then the gametophyte, like leafy stage on top. If it will propagate on its own, but if you're trying to preserve the way it looks in nature, just be careful when you're harvesting it because you can tear it apart real easily. But if you're removing it because you don't want it there, then of course there's no need to be careful. You'll probably want like a wire brush or a scraper to get the job done pretty easily. But I highly suggest you don't use herbicides or pesticides to control moss, because not only will that be temporarily effective, because like they spread like crazy, it's also harmful for you and other humans close by, plus all the other animals. So maybe you have an asphalt shingle roof. I know a lot of us have a lot of moss growing on either one part of the roof, or eventually it builds up. What you can try, it's a lot less harmful, of course, is try diluted, cheap, no dye or no fragrance dishwashing soap solutions. So like, I don't know, a light solution, like 10% solution, you can mix up into a bucket and like spray, because that will actually be the safest and most effective way of removing moss in an area. You may have seen or have installed even those metal strips, which like are zinc or copper, and they can cause leaching into waterways. So the same thing that kills the moss, because the whole point of those strips is for it to leach over the side of your house so that it makes kind of like a zinc solution or a copper solution. It's poisonous to the moss. It keeps it from growing there. But of course, some of that like zinc in certain quantities can kill fish. So if you live close to wetlands and areas, I would highly recommend to stay away from those metal strips. Copper as well, right, is harmful in the same ways. So by following those guidelines, I think moss can be harvested and managed sustainably. So have fun mossing out there, incorporating them into your garden, or trying some kokedama as well. They're fun. So
Danlyn, we have, before the next poll, we have quite a few questions in just a few minutes. So I wonder if we want to answer those and then leave space right here at the end for people to kind of wrap up the webinar with responding to this one.
Let's do that. Yeah, I'll go ahead.
So one question was, how is algae related, is like Irish moss?
Okay, yeah. So Irish moss, another thing, isn't moss. And you'll be so surprised how many times people call something moss, even in its folk name, like something like Irish moss, and it's not moss. It's either a vascular plant or it's lichen. A lot of times they're lichens. old man's beard. I've heard of that one. People will call that moss. It's also a lichen. And I'm sorry, the question again was,
How is algae related?
how is algae related? Okay, so lichen is considered a holobiont. Hollow meaning like it's everyone, hollow all together, and it's a organism that's actually a bunch of organisms living together. So it's mostly a fungus, and then the fungus kind of harvest algae, which is pretty neat. I don't like, how does that happen? I don't know how it occurs, but lichen will hold on to algae species, and that's what makes them green, because it's actually fungus wrapping around little algae cells, and then the algae, I guess, make the food for the fungus. So they have this interesting relationship. And I also have heard from researchers that there are specific bacteria that grow on specific lichens, and even viruses. So the bacteria, viruses, and algae and fungus together create one type of lichen. That's why the lichen is an organism made out of many organisms.
Real quick, can I jump in? Because I know we're running out of time, and if people have to jump off before the end
Sure,
of the hour, would it be possible to run our next poll, and I could just share sort of what the next steps and plans are for the grant?
Yeah.
But I just want to make sure the poll is intended to get people's insights on what would be valuable moving forward, and so if we could run that real quick, and while people are
Now I can see these
answering that.
questions.
Sounds good. And Danlyn, you could potentially answer these questions
Yeah.
in the Q&A while that's.
That sounds good. I'll do that. Yeah. And then let me move to the poll. You can see that next. Cool. Now I'll answer. I'll type some.
There we go.
Oh.
Perfect. So as you all answer those questions, just we're trying to gather some feedback on what's valuable to you all, as it's great to have a very interested and informed audience here. And with the conservation education grants, some of the future activities will be developing an educational brochure, summarizing a lot of the information that's been shared today, as well as a little bit, focusing on the application oriented. What are some opportunities to help homeowners better use moss in the landscape and find more sustainable ways to manage it? So that's the last main deliverable from the grant is to have a educational brochure. But there's opportunities to do more things here in terms of these activities. So we'd love to hear more. And I believe in the follow-up survey, there's an opportunity to share your email. So if you want to stay informed in what we're doing, and if we plan any of these kinds of activities listed here, we'd love to keep everyone engaged in that.
Yeah. Now that we know so many people are interested in moss, we could do more events like these. So yeah, I see some really good questions in here too. And I think if you have to go, because now we're reaching, it's almost 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for being here and having so much interest in moss and wanting to. I know like some people want to learn about how to remove moss, or maybe how to keep it around. What's the best species to grow in a concrete wall was one of the questions. That's a great question. That one company, Respire, that's actually what they do. They're trying to research like what's the best moss as a concrete wall species would work. And right now I know there's a lot of good ones here. Maybe I would say Bryum. Bryum is a good one. Bryum, usually all the Bryum species, and maybe I can answer that.
So Danlyn, are you able to stay on a little longer to answer any of these questions for folks who want to hang on?
Definitely. Yeah.
Awesome. And we had 100% participation on that poll. So thank you.
Yay,
nice.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, this is great.
Cool.
Yeah, this will definitely help us plan future activities. So thank you for that information.
Oh, books, really quick, because I do have a lot of books to share. I think the best resource for moss identification, especially in the Pacific Northwest. This is my favorite one by far. It's called Common Mosses of Western Oregon and Washington by Bruce McCune. So maybe there's a way I can send out like a list of any of you who have, shared your email to keep in touch with us. We can share a list of moss identification books and even the moss glossary, like I mentioned too. There's also cool articles that come out that like Evantia, which is all about bryophytes. So lots of cool moss stuff out there. But yeah, for identification in the Pacific Northwest, Bruce McCune is kind of like the guy. Kieran, I know you've spoken with him.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Great. Yeah.
So really good pictures in here, and you can carry that with you while you're walking through the woods and identify mosses. So let's see.
And I'll just share one more thing about the
go
other
ahead.
SWCD grant that we have is we will have some results on how some local mosses function here in terms of enhancing pollinator habitat. How do they function in terms of mitigating stormwater pollution? Can we use them in within green infrastructure planting palettes to better establish vegetation and restoration projects? So there's a number of questions we're trying to answer with this other project. So that'll be something that we can share with folks as well if they're interested.
Okay, boy, and I see, another one. I'm gonna try to regarding removing moss from asphalt shingle roofs, is it hydrogen peroxide mixture effective and not detrimental to the environment like dish soap option? I mean, hydrogen peroxide is like a master oxidant, right? So it will kill a lot of stuff. And kind of like bleach would, you can use, I know people have used bleach solutions, but even asking a lot of my other friend moss researchers, we kind of debated about this and said the soap solution I think will be the most effective, cheapest, and not detrimental to the environment. So I'd use that over the hydrogen peroxide. And let's see, is moss ever damaged by absorbing too much pollution? So that's something that we're seeing a little bit of the preliminary results in, where when we put moss into water with really high concentrations of different pollutants, right? Some of them will absorb the pollutants and then kind of like spit it back out, which is really, really fascinating. We were all like, oh my God, like they absorb it and will hold on to it for a little while, and suddenly the moss will get rid of it. So we think that there's something happening where they do not care for having all that pollutant, absorbed into them, and they will actually release it. So that's still a question that we need to answer. But we do believe that obviously there are things that kill mosses or make them less likely to grow in that area, but they grow in really toxic environments. So, they're pretty tough. Let's see. High desert mosses. There are lots of high desert mosses. I know when I go out to high deserts here in Oregon, I'm looking for different mosses out there. Another book that would mention maybe more of the drier mosses is this California Mosses book. This is by Bill and Nancy Malcolm. There's a lot more kind of arid area mosses that are covered in this book. So usually if I can't find them in the Bruce McCune book, that's why I'll keep this one on me. There's some really cool mosses in high desert areas that you wouldn't even recognize as mosses. Look at it, it might look like a black crust on a rock. If you look close, it's a moss. So those are really cool. Go moss hunting, find some. They're neat to look at, especially if you have even like a jeweler's loop. That's what I use. Bringing a microscope around hiking isn't very convenient. So yeah, I recommend a jeweler's loop if you want to have something to look at mosses up close. Is there a good phone app for Moss ID? So far, I have not found a very reliable one, but the one that I use, because I think it's really good with plants, and actually Kieran, you're the one who suggested that one, and I was kind of fighting it for a while. I'm like, I don't know if it's very good. And it got better because it's now like crowdsourced. So even I'll go on there, especially with the mosses, and I'll say, okay, no, that moss has been improperly identified, right? So, and then I'll tell them, you know, you can add, anyone can add to it and say, oh, this is this species, it's not the other one. So what is that one called?
I just wanted to show real quick. I found this is what I was digging around for. There's the jeweler's loop that Danlyn was talking about, and I also found one of these. I think I got it on Amazon, just a little microscope that or magnifying glass, you know, for 10, 20, and 30x. It's got a light and UV light. So that's also been helpful. Little pocket.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. You have your little like mossing kit. That's what I have, a bag that's just my mossing bag that I take with me. So this one, it's called was this sorry. Picture This is the name of the app. Yeah. And it's really good for other plants, and it has identified some mosses, but we're still working on it. Let's see. You mentioned a few species. Can you please put the spelling in the chat? Yeah. Helicomnium. Yeah, let me type those. Of course, I need to check my spelling of a lot of these too, because they're tricky. Helicomnium.
Well, Danlyn's doing that. I can try and help with the other ones. So the moss lawn is a great question. I think you know, there's a lot of that. It's a bit of a nuanced question because it depends on the shade conditions and the grass conditions. So I've seen, you know, and it depends on the existing grass species. You know, sometimes moss will do its job if you just let it, if the conditions are right, and could eventually overtake grass. There's, and you know, on geologic time scale, that's true. You know, moss will win in most cases against turf grass. I think the other way, you know, I've seen examples of people either completely tearing out grass and starting moss lawns with fragments, or you know, sort of sheet planting the moss and starting it in little locations and letting it spread. So I don't know that there's a best way, and I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Danlyn, when you're done with that, but I think a lot of it depends on the condition, the sun, water, soil conditions for how you would consider replacing grass with moss. But it's a great question, and you know, probably could be something we could do a whole workshop on.
Yeah, and there's a few people online. I think Moss and Annie.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Moss and Annie
awesome.
has a really good website that kind of describes the process of replacing lawns with moss, right? It shows some.
Your YouTube channel has a lot, yeah. So it's all free. She's got a lot of great stuff. So, and she's got a great book too. So there's lots of great moss books out there.
Yeah, and actually, to speak to the Helicomnium, it's not Helicomnium, it's Homolothecium. Forgive me. I get those two mixed up a lot. It's obviously the words are kind of tricky. But, and hopefully I spelled this right. So Homolothecium is the one that grows on cement and branches, is really pretty like that. You'll see it growing on a lot of maple trees too. And then what would be the best species to grow in a concrete wall? Okay, I think I answered. Let me type that answer. So Bryum, and I guess, like I said, the Homolothecium. Bryum is really pretty, and it's a shame I couldn't get into more just Bryum specific stuff, because Bryum almost looks glassy, and it almost looks like frosted. It's like almost like a light green, and it's because it's very reflective. So it's used to reflect light off. I mean, it uses that as an adaptation to reflect light in really highlight areas. So that's a cool one and grows really well. Moss as a houseplant. Yeah, I've tried to keep moss alive on the base of my plants. It just needs to be kept moist, you know, but like we were saying, moss survives in a lot of different areas. So I've put moss in my pots outside, and I live in an apartment, so I have a balcony here, and the squirrels and the birds take my moss a lot of the time because they will use it for nesting. So yeah, if you keep it inside, yeah, hopefully like your cats and other animals aren't digging into.
Contributing to habitat restoration and
Exactly.
contributing to the ecosystem.
Yes.
There's an interesting example. The last question about moss being evergreen. The company in Germany, Green City Solutions, has been working on developing a building panel that would stay evergreen, that without an irrigation system, because the example Danlyn showed is very high tech. I mean, they have fans and pumps and irrigation system that's all automated and hooked up to, the internet, and very complex and fancy. They're also more slowly developing a panel that can stay green, basically by weaning the moss off of water, in the right way. They were able to keep it green, at least in Germany. I'm sure there are examples where that's not going to be possible, but I think here in some cases you see it in nature.
They stay green. I mean, the green is the chlorophyll, right?
Yeah.
It's so if it's photosynthesizing, usually it stays green. But there has been a question within, the research groups that I work with about, is the brown tissue still alive or not? And there's been some evidence to show that actually the brown tissue is still somewhat alive. That's a little hard for me to wrap my mind around. And even in this picture, you can see there's so this is, we call it Campy, the one that's on the top left. So Campylopus intraflexus. It's really tall shoots, and you can see some of it's brown in the middle, and then it's all green on top. But there's a lot of complex biochemistry happening between fungal species and then the mosses that form these mats and these colonies like this. So there's chemical exchange happening. Whether the cells are alive or not, or if they're evergreen, is kind of debatable. But it's all kind of still mysterious, which is why studying moss is so much fun.
Danlyn, I think you answered a question that just came in, which was, are there organisms that live in moss?
Yes, especially springtails. Springtails are really cool. Little vertebrate. They look like crabs almost, and they are the ones that most scientists say they're the ones responsible for moving the moss sperm around. So springtails. If you look them up, they're ubiquitous in moss. Like you'll find them in almost any moss patch that you're digging through. And I also find a lot of little mites and spiders. So under the microscope again, like just searching around in the moss, I see a lot of little critters in there. And then suggestions of species for creating a moss roof on a small structure. Yes. So if you're creating a moss roof that you want to keep going, you want it something that will, I actually want to recommend Campy, but a lot of the ecologists don't like when I do that because it's considered an invasive species. So Campylopus intraflexus is endemic to South America, but it's now, you'll see it all over the coast in the Pacific Northwest, but it's really, really good because it grows on sand. So it's really good at growing on a green roof. And it can survive under really high light conditions. But you have to kind of go harvest it yourself from the coast, and you could propagate it through the sporophytes, right? All those spores, you can collect those sporophytes and basically make like take all the fragments of it and then spread it out on like a rooftop and see if it takes. But another species that we are actually working with right now, which is, I would say, good for is oh my goodness, I don't know why. Thank you, Racometrium. Thank you, Kieran. Yeah,
the engineer comes through. Yes.
I know, under the gun sometimes I'm like, oh, I forget the names. But yeah, Racometrium is really, really good, I think, for a moss roof application because it grows on sand very well. It tolerates very high light, very high heat, and then stays pretty green throughout the whole year. And it's really easy to get to grow. So it grows pretty quickly too.
I think a general suggestion on that for me is always trying to find the environment that you're trying to recreate. So if you see you have a roof that's in certain conditions, that's shade, sun, moisture conditions, if you can find somewhere else like that where moss is growing, and maybe just harvest a little bit, follow the sustainable harvest protocols that Danlyn mentioned earlier. So that's typically what I try to do, is like have my reference ecology or reference situations. Well, it survived well already in nature in this place, so it should hopefully take. And the other thing is diversity is good too. You know, try a couple different species and see what takes, because every situation is different, and sometimes plants don't do what we expect them to, and you know, nature does something else. So having a few species to try is always good.
Yeah, and that I would say, you know, there are some species that like particular types of substrate, right? So you might really like a moss that grows on a tree, but then trying to get that moss to grow on your, you know, cement patio is just not going to work out. So, you know, letting it take on whatever mix of like volunteers, I think, is one of the best ways to just kind of let it grow where it wants to grow to. Let's see. So best way to preserve herbaceous specimen, kind of in the same way that we talked about what would be best to keep stuff alive on a green roof. It's kind of creating the environment that species would want to live in your herbarium, like in your, and I'm guessing that's what you mean, right? But the herbaceous specimens is like in a, you know, like a, what do they call it? Like a herbarium, yeah. In an herbarium, right, where you're putting a bunch of mosses and other plants in together. Some just don't like each other, so I'd say a lot of it is, you know, experimentation and seeing which mosses do really well. The Ceratodon species that I mentioned is a really tough one and will grow with like any other moss. It's not very picky. So Ceratodon, the moss that sounds like a dinosaur, that one is really good. So
clarification on that one.
Herbarium specimens, like, gotcha. Yeah, in an herbarium, sorry, like to preserve them. So, I mean, there are a lot of herbarium specimens like at PSU, and they're dried, they're flat and dried as you would a vascular plant. And they're done the same way. I know that some species, we keep them in different, it's like a glycol solution, I think, which is then a wet solution to keep, so you can still see all the leaf structures as if it were wet, because some species, when they dry, their leaf structure completely changes. It like crumples into a little curlicue. So in order to preserve it in its kind of wet state, yeah, you might want to consider your preservation method that way. And then invasive species are usually negative. Does that moss overtake other species niches, or is it more just so because they're invasive because it isn't endemic to the area? This is one of my favorite topics to debate with my other moss friends, the researchers, because we don't like calling it invasive, because Campylopus intraflexus there, it grows amongst other species. It does spread a lot, so it's possible that it's overtaking, but it's also helping to avoid like erosion, because a lot of it grows along the dunes down there along the coast, near like north of Coos Bay area is where I go, and I see a lot of it growing there. And it seems to be happily incorporated into the landscape, along with many other small plant species, other moss species, lots of other moss species. Often Polytrichum juniperinum grows within it too, but it does get so dense that it becomes these huge mats of just Campy. And so I can see why ecologists might say, oh, that's an invasive species, it's kind of taking over. And yes, also the fact that it's not endemic to the area and it spreads very quickly, because I think over just a few years ago, there was not as much Campylopus being spotted on the coast. And there's actually a project going on right now where people are identifying Campylopus and where it is spreading to, because it seems to be something of a concern to ecologists because it spreads so quickly. But yeah, so far, I think it's looking pretty nice, but I probably shouldn't tell people to go spread it around.
All right, that's all the questions we have. There is a very short poll when we close the webinar, or you leave it.
Okay, yeah, not that full. Yeah.
Yeah, just a follow-up survey and opportunity to provide your email address so we can follow up with you. And it sounds like everyone who registers will follow up with a recording and maybe some book recommendations so that they can go do some more studying.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danlyn and Kieran. Any final thoughts before we close out?
I'm just curious, will the people who registered but couldn't attend have opportunity to give the survey or respond to a survey?
We can try to figure that out, yeah, and make
Okay.
that option available.
I really appreciate everyone's time, and we still have 27 people on sticking around this long. So
Yeah, cool.
yeah, it's very much appreciated, and thank you to everybody, and thank you, Adriana, for helping us.
Yeah. And for those of you, I guess, who stuck around, you get the treat of hearing the Moss song at the end that I saved for all of you. So thanks again for joining us on a Wednesday. Yeah, it looks pretty sunny out there if you're here in Oregon, in Portland. Hope you get outside, check out some moss.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.